and he said in Italian, "Io sono Tommaso Buscetta," meaning that I'm Tommaso Buscetta, and what you said insulted me.
Offensive. Mm-hmm.
And the guy just shivered, because you saw his eyes glazed over. I mean, he was a stone killer.
This is Inside the Life with Giovanni and Dutch, produced by the Mob Museum, presented by Levy Online and Levy Production Group. Giovanni, Rocco, and Dutch McAlpin are former police and federal task force operatives. They infiltrated drug cartels, outlaw motorcycle groups, and the Mafia. Now, they share their stories, along with others who have gone inside the life.
Welcome to Inside the Life. I'm your host, Giovanni Rocco. I'm here with my co-host, Dutch. And today's guest is the legendary pizza connection, Frank Panessa, a.k.a. Frankie Pagano, a.k.a. Frankie Pizza.
Good
Frank,
to be here.
Thanks for coming. We have a lot to cover in a short period of time. I guess we should just jump right in and share your story with everybody and let them know how this all started, right? Where your journey began in law enforcement and this crazy roller coaster of a ride that you've had as far as covert world goes. So you're born in Yonkers, New York, right?
Yes, I was born in Yonkers, New York. In the late 60s, the New York News at that time had a federal employment center on the first floor, and they had all sorts of brochures. And I saw a brochure that said, "Be a Treasury agent." So at that time, under the Department of the Treasury, back in 67, you had Customs, Secret Service, Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Mm-hmm. So you would put down the three agencies that you were interested in, and in those days, you had to take an exam. And how you placed on the exam, like when the first agency had an opening for an agent, they'd go to the top of the exam and say, "Okay, are you interested?"
Right.
Well, the first agency was Customs, and that was in 1967. And it was okay, but I wanted a bit more excitement. So I put in an application for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1968. By the time I got, they hired me. By the time I got there, they had changed the name from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics to the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs.
Right.
And I was in the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs until 1973, when President Nixon came up with the Drug Enforcement Administration under the Department of Justice. Mm-hmm. And from there, I worked until 1995.
Okay, so you began as an investigator, as a case agent, and just building cases in the DEA.
Yeah.
At what point do you decide that your calling was covert operations and undercover work?
I guess my looks. My group supervisor says, "You're going out and buy some heroin."
Right.
So the first heroin deal I did, I mean, I was green.
Yeah.
I meet a guy with the informant. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, the guy, the violator is supposed to have the heroin in the car.
Right.
So we walk up to the car, and I says, "Do you have this stuff?" He says, "Yeah." And so he says, "Let me see the money." Well, I take out the money. The damn informant grabs the money and hands it to the guy.
Right.
And the guy takes off.
He ran with your money?
This was my first buy as an agent. So now it's starting to rain. Well, the informant says, "Well, he'll be back with the dope, you know." So there I am like a jabroni standing in the rain because, my first case. And in the meantime, the assistant group supervisor comes up to me, on the side, and he says, "If he doesn't come back, you have to make good for the money."
Right.
I'm making $5,300 a year. I got 3 kids, and they want me to keep,
right.
Where were you when you did this first deal?
This was in Brooklyn.
And you said your supervisor said you should buy heroin based on how you looked. Like what?
Yeah,
what did you
because
look like?
I had the map of Italy on my face.
Okay.
You had a New York way about you. You're from Yonkers. You knew
I'm
to
from
walk.
Yonkers. I grew up in an Italian neighborhood.
Right.
We had the good, the bad, and the ugly in the neighborhood, and everybody had the nicknames like Tony Baloney,
right.
Cherry Nose, and people like that.
Yeah.
My mother was a saint, but yet every day she played a nickel or a dime on the numbers.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
You know, that was a way of life, and that was accepted back then.
Right.
And everybody knew everybody's business. And growing up in an Italian neighborhood, as a 5-year-old, they would send me down to the bakery to get bread every day.
Right.
That's unheard of today, you know. Everybody in the neighborhood knew me.
Right.
You know, I'd go down to the bakery. On the way home, I'd bite off the end of the bread, you know, that type of thing.
But it's a cultural thing, right? And I think I grew up in the same type of environment, and it made it a bit of an easier transition when I went into undercover work. But you have to be careful, right? Because if you come on too strong with our culture, with the neighborhood, you know, with that neighborhood or that overpowering persona, you got to be real careful how you walk in.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
No, I see. I had it good because I had a lot of covers that I could fall back on if somebody asked me.
Right.
You know, and I was in deep cover. The government put me in where I did exist as Frank Pagano.
Right. Right.
I mean, if you were to go to the day that I said I was born and where I was born, and if you were to go to the records, you'd see that Frank Pagano was born on that day.
So you had like a heavily backstopped.
Right in. They had that backdrop.
What he's kind of talking about is like, was your undercover identity, right?
Oh, yes.
And the fact that it was bad guy proof. They could look you up on whatever's available at the time. They could search you and you would exist, correct?
Yeah. Like in the Pizza Connection case, I had to be somebody. In those days, you had Dun and Broad Street, where they would check your credit reference. So one of the first things they did, and at the time, Rudy Giuliani was the assistant attorney general. And Rudy Giuliani asked me, he says, Frank, what do you need? I says, I really need to be somebody. So they put $500,000 in an account. So if anybody was to check Frankie Pagano with DMB, they'd see that, you know, I had money in an account. I had a credit card. The biggest thing that I had, because I knew in the Pizza Connection case I'd be traveling around the world, I needed a passport.
Right.
And especially for Italy, because in those days, when you checked into a hotel in Italy, you had to hand them your passport.
Right.
Okay? And they were required to make a copy of it and give it to the Questora, which is the local police station. Now, there was no way I was going to travel on Frank Panessa. And so, you know, the powers to be in DEA said, oh, no, there's no way we can get you a real passport. Rudy Giuliani says, I'll take care of it.
Did you know Rudy Giuliani? Was it like a personal favorite kind of?
As an agent on the street in the late 60s, Rudy was an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District
trying to
of
make
New
his
York.
way.
And I used to bring my cases to him. So he knew me as an agent on the street.
Right.
So when we went to Washington, D.C., Rudy remembered me, and he would do anything for me. I mean, they came up with $1 million for me to spend. You know, if I'm gonna be somebody, I can't go in like we normally did, where you'd buy an ounce of heroin,
Right.
you know, and then another week later, you might buy another ounce, or you order up a quarter,
Right.
and then you bust the person. Well, this wasn't going to be the case.
But it's hard, right? You know, and I guess everybody has to understand when you do covert work, you're becoming another human being, right? A completely different person, social security numbers, dates of birth, the credit history. You might be somebody of wealth where you and I grew up in a neighborhood, or we all grew up in neighborhoods where we weren't well off.
Oh, no.
Right?
No.
So now I have to give this persona of, I'm walking around with $1 million. You have to sell this.
Yeah,
right?
true.
And the constant stress and stresses of being that guy, being Frank Pagano, and never screwing up. Because when you check in a hotel and somebody says your name, you're so instinctively want to say Frank Panessa, but you can't.
Well, see, that was one thing I always did. I always used FP. I always used Frank.
Yeah.
And I always used P as the last name. And I'll tell you how that paid off. I was with the Sicilians at the San Gennaro Festival in New York, which is a big festival. And out of the blue, a cousin of mine that I haven't seen in years comes running up to me. Frank, how are you? So I grab her. I says, Barbara, I'm undercover. Be cool. You know, oh, I understand. Now, let's say I was using the name Jimmy.
Right.
And she comes up and says, Frank, how are you? You know, the Sicilians would look at me cross-eyed, you know, saying, who the hell is, who's Jimmy?
Who's Jimmy? Right.
Yeah,
right.
you know.
Yeah.
One thing you have to remember, I existed in their life What I told them yesterday, I had to remember. What I told them last month, I had to remember because they did.
Yep. And they don't forget.
No, they
Their
don't
brains
forget.
are like trapped. They remember everything
don't
you
forget.
say. No.
You know, and in my cover, you know, the Sicilians, even though they were big heroin dealers, they were family men.
Right.
You know, they had families, and they asked me about my family. So to cover, I said that I was divorced, but I had a 19-year-old daughter. And my ex-wife was busting my horn. She wouldn't let me see my daughter and all that.
Right.
Because there came a time, we went to a restaurant in New York called Roma Nova. And they said, we want to introduce you to the young chef. He's 23 years old, and he's not in our business. And so they bring this kid out, you know. He says, oh, Mr. Pagano, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'd like you to try my different pastas. I says, well, how many pasta dishes do you make? He says, 7. I says, give me some of each.
Right. Right.
You know, like a true
Make them work.
mafioso.
Make them work. Right.
You know,
of course.
give me some of each.
All right. A little bit.
And so they're saying to me, you know, we want to, what we used to say in slang, they want to do mushamal.
Yeah.
They want to introduce the chef to my daughter. You know, so you had to do things like that.
Yeah, it was a dance. It was a dance.
You
But
know.
now you carried this. You created this legend of Frank Pagano, and that's the legend that you carried over into the Pizza Connection, right? And along with supporting other undercovers along the way.
Oh, yes.
How do you work the Pizza Connection? How do you come into that case?
Okay. We knew that the Sicilians in Philadelphia were distributors of heroin. We arrested 2 wise guys in the Bruno family. And when when you sit down with them and say, hey, you have to do the right thing or you're going to go to jail. So both of them said, well, we're not going to give you anybody in the Bruno family.
Right.
You know, I says, well, what about the Sicilians? Oh, they're not Italian. Yeah. So I says, yeah.
Really?
So I says, okay, we'll come up with the story that I'm the main hijacker in the Bruno family for everything, especially cigarettes, because at that time, remember when you went into restaurants, you had the cigarette
Yeah,
machines,
the old pull machines.
the pull cigarette
yeah.
machines.
I'm glad you know what they
Yeah,
are.
I do.
Well,
That's
the
a certain year.
Sicilian, Alberto Ficalora, had 80 machines.
Okay.
So they go to him and say, hey, you know, Frankie Pagano, one of the bosses, they just hijacked the shipment of cigarettes.
Right.
And so Ficalora says, oh boy, I'd be interested in that. And so at the time, he was buying cartons of cigarettes for $7.10 a carton. Okay. We, as the government, went out and bought them for $7.10 a carton.
Right.
But I sold them to him for $4 a carton.
Right.
And we wrote off the $3.10 a carton as an investigative expense.
Gotcha. And
So
again,
now
cigarettes are everything in the street. And even
Yeah,
today,
they're-
like in our cases, we use those.
Yeah, we use cigarettes.
You know,
Even
it's gold.
Oh,
It'll
yeah.
never. It's
Modern
always
day.
going to be gold in the street. Cigarettes are everything.
And that was kind of your. I kind of want to slow you down just for a second because I think you guys both know so much about the mafiosa and the Pizza Connection. But like, what was the first cigarette deal like? Like, this is when you're really, like we say, earning your bones and making your introduction. So can you
Yeah.
kind of describe like where it was and how it went?
Yes.
Like, we all know how a cigarette deal goes, but
Yeah. Well, the 2 wise guys said to the Sicilians, we'll bring Frankie Pagano to such and such a restaurant in Philly to introduce you to him. So when we go into the restaurant, a wise guy sits on each side of me, and I had an undercover agent as my bodyguard standing behind me, okay? And the 2 Sicilians were sitting down at the other end of the table. And so when the drinks came out, the wise guys made sure I was served first. And when the food came out, they served me first. So now the Sicilians, men of honor, are looking at this and saying, you know, we know these are 2 made guys.
Right.
and why did they do that? Had you been in this restaurant before? Did they know who you were, or was it based
these
simply on the
made
way
guy-
you looked?
These made guys were the guys we flipped.
They're
Oh,
vouching.
to be
okay, I'm following you now.
informants.
They're
Right.
playing along.
Okay.
And they're
Okay, yeah.
vouching for you.
Yeah.
And so when the food came out, they served me first. So the Sicilians are looking at this, they're saying, well, we know these are two made guys. He must be somebody.
Right.
And, you know, from that day on, they never questioned it.
Really?
Because it was like Mission Impossible.
Yeah.
You know, the smoking mirrors.
Yeah.
And so the Sicilian starts talking to me. He says, oh, I really respected your boss, meaning Angelo Bruno, who was the head of the Mafia family
Bruno
in
crime
Philadelphia.
family. Yeah.
And then he says, oh, I hear you have cigarettes. I says, yeah. Yeah, why? You interested? Yeah, how much will you charge me? You know?
Right.
So I says, oh, how about $4 a carton? Well, he jumped on it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know? So the first deal we did was cigarettes.
Mm-hmm.
And that went on, selling cigarettes. And then they had pizza shops. So, of course, we stole tomato sauce, sold tomato sauce to them, sold cheese to them.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, growing up in that neighborhood, they were controlled. All the pizza shops, and that's important for everybody to understand how the pizza connection came to be.
They had 20 pizza shops in Philadelphia, in the Philadelphia area. And see, what they would do is they'd bring in, I call them slaves from Sicily.
Right.
And we called them zips.
Zips, yeah.
And they worked in the pizza shops. Not only did they work in the pizza shops, but if any contracts came up, they did the contracts.
Right.
Not only for the Sicilians, but for the Italian American Mafia.
Yeah.
What's a zip?
That was a name that they came up with. I guess zip, they would do anything for you, you know.
Yeah.
And that's a name that I heard from the Italian Americans. Oh yeah, all those zips worked there. I never questioned what zip meant.
I understand.
Right.
You know, but these were guys that were from the hometown in Sicily, and they were indentured slaves. They worked in those pizza shops, plus they took on the contracts, plus they did the distribution of the heroin.
And I knew them and I understood zips. Again, there's several meetings, right? Depends on who you ask, like anything, but zips are the guys, exactly what Frank said. They would fly him in. They might fly him in to do a hit. So they zip him in, zip him out, right? And that was one.
I guess that could have been the expression.
Yeah, it's so many
Zip them in and
different,
zip
you
them
know,
out.
it depends on who you ask. But some of these guys were good in tradecraft too. They were good masons. They were good laborers.
Oh, definitely.
So they would bring these guys
that's
over
how-
back in the day and say, wait a minute, you know, Dutch, you're good at this, but why don't you stay? And they kept you, whether it's work in a restaurant or do some mason work or, you know.
They did everything.
Yeah. And they wanted you back home. They'd send you back home. Yeah.
You know, people have to understand, and the audience has to understand, there's two mafias. There's the Sicilian mafia and the American mafia. And the American mafia, everybody's familiar with the five families in New York, you know, Gambino and them.
Right.
But I was involved with the Sicilian mafia, the Bonanno family, although Bonanno was also American mafia,
Right.
but it was strictly Sicilians.
Right.
And they were responsible for the heroin distribution under Lilo Galante. He was the one that controlled all the heroin coming into the United States.
Right.
So now I'm selling them cigarettes.
Yeah.
And, you know, you have to know when it's time to hit them.
It's like, here's some cigarettes. How about some heroin?
Yeah,
Like,
you know,
kind of
you
a
just
soft
can't go in and say,
introduction.
hey, here's a carton of cigarettes. Hey,
Give
by
me
the way,
some
do you have
heroin.
heroin?
Right. Yeah,
No,
yeah.
it doesn't work that way.
And that's based on relationships, right? We've all kind of,
It
the
is.
three of us have done that where, yeah, you have to know when to strike and you have to know how many crumbs to put down on the ground, right? For them to bite
Exactly.
and the bait that you throw out there. Because if it's, eventually they're going to ask because they're always nosy, right? So what else do you have? This is all you have is cigarettes? You're building a life on selling cigarettes, but, you know, making money on that?
Yeah.
No, I got other things.
Well-
and it's what you paint the picture for them.
Well, what I did was, again, I use the slang, a morsa cusi. I had a sad face. So Ficalora says to me, Cugina, he used to call me cousin. What's wrong? I says, well, you know, Alberto, I do something else. He says, what do you mean you do something else? I says, you know, I do white powder. Why didn't you tell me? He says, we control all the white powder.
Yeah.
He says, who you buying from? So thank God I was buying from a guy in the Genovese family in New York that we hadn't arrested.
Wow.
Okay. So I says, I'm getting it from so-and-so in the Bronx. He says, we sell it to him.
Really?
He says, from now on, you get it from us.
Oh, all right. That makes life easy.
And I was in.
Tell us about your first heroin deal with him.
Okay.
Because
what happens
and
is,
kind of what year is it? And like everybody has a perception of how the heroin deal goes from HBO or on TV or whatever now. Like tell us what it's like in your area.
Mine was funny. They had set me up in a penthouse apartment as Frankie Pagano. And in those days, you couldn't have a building higher than 18 stories in Philadelphia because no building could be higher than the William Penn statue on City Hall.
Right.
So I had an 18th floor penthouse on 15th and Locust. Okay. And so what had happened was they, I would go to the penthouse every day, go up to the penthouse. I'd park my undercover car in the garage. In those days, they had call forwarding, but it wasn't for John Q. Public. So I would put the phone on call forwarding to my house in Medford, New Jersey. And there was a special phone in there where my kids knew never to answer the phone. Only my wife would answer the phone.
Right.
So I would set that up, go down into the garage, get into another car, and go out to Jersey to spend the night with my family. Okay. I get a call one night on the red phone, and it's the Sicilian. And he says, "Oh, we're downstairs," meaning downstairs in the apartment in Philadelphia. Now, I'm in Medford, New Jersey.
Right.
And so right away, which everybody understands, I says, "Oh, you caught me on a bad time. I'm with my gumare," which means my girlfriend.
Right.
I says, "Why don't I meet you at a restaurant in about a half hour?" And so I told him to go to a restaurant called La Buca, which was a mob restaurant in Philly. So now I had to get surveillance agents. I'm in Medford, New Jersey. I can only find one agent.
Yeah.
So I go to La Buca, and I'm inside with them.
Did he tell you why he wanted you to meet? Why
They just said no.
They just
the
showed
guy
up.
from
They just showed up and
Piccolora
then-
says to me, "My man from New York is here."
So is that the heroin guy?
That's the heroin
Okay, so
guy.
You're going now to do this heroin deal.
Okay, so now I go to La Buca, and there's three of them there. There's Piccolora, there's a guy by the name of Frank Panessa, and there was Paolo Laporta, who was the heroin guy.
Right.
And the Fadagato were the heroin people. So they said, "Let's go for a ride." I says, "Holy Christ, we're going for a ride."
You only have one agent?
Yeah,
That's
one agent
supposed to
in
be
a
your
car.
surveillance and security
So
team?
I get into the car in the back seat with two of them.
Okay.
And we go about a block and a half, and I'm looking, and I see we lost the agent.
Oh, no.
So now I'm with them.
Of course.
So we have a conversation. They said, "We hear you're interested in getting heroin." I says, "A product." They said, they didn't say heroin. You know, they said product. And I says, "Yeah." They says, "Well, we don't do less than kilos at a time." I says, "I don't even know who the hell you are, and you want me to do a kilo with you." I says, "Bang," you know?
Good pushback.
And so Piccolora wanted the deal to go down. So Ficcolora's trying to be the diplomat. He says, "Why don't we do just a deal like for $85,000? And so Franco Fadagato says, "Why are we not selling a kilo?" I says, "I don't know you, you know?" So
Are you telling me a kilo costs more than $85,000?
in those days,
Yeah,
it was like,
I'm
it
trying
was
to bring-
like
that's what I mean.
$150,000
Okay.
for a pure kilo of heroin.
Yeah.
But you have to understand, and the audience has to understand, that if I was a bad guy and I bought a kilo of heroin for $150,000
On the first deal.
on the first deal, I would whack it,
Yeah.
meaning that I would cut it,
Right.
and then I would sell it to distributors, and my profit would be, after all I sold that kilo, would be almost $1 million.
Easily,
Okay.
yeah. Yep.
So what happens is I says, "Okay, I'll do the $85,000. Now I have to go back to DEA and say I need $85,000 for the first buy.
Right.
Well, thank God Rudy Giuliani says, "No problem.
Really?
No
Because
problem."
85 grand in that
Hey,
time.
back in those days was major money. Major.
2015 had a hard time getting $85,000 for anything.
So
Like
when it comes time to do the deal, I'm in my penthouse, and there was a restaurant across the street, a coffee shop across the street from my penthouse. And so I said to the Sicilians, I'll meet you in the coffee shop. So when I go into the coffee shop, there's Paolo Laporta and Alberto Ficalora sitting at a booth. And when I sit down at the booth, they hand me a birthday present. It's wrapped in a birthday present.
Right.
And they said, "Happy birthday."
Yeah.
And they hand me the present, you know. And of course, the heroin was in there. And so they said, I said, "Well, let me go, you know, let me bring my present upstairs, you know." So I go upstairs and we test the heroin. And of course, it came back good.
Are they with you when you go upstairs?
And they were downstairs waiting in the restaurant.
Did you give them the money?
No, I didn't have the money with me.
So the money's
they
not
gave me the
exchanged. They give you
heroin.
the heroin. When you go upstairs,
Yeah.
you test it. It tests
That's
positive.
the trust they had in me.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's insane.
And this
They're
is the
giving me
first heroin.
$85,000 worth of heroin, and I'm leaving with a present, a birthday
Yeah.
present wrap. So when I get upstairs, I unwrap the present, and there's a pair of pants. And inside the pair of pants is the heroin.
Right.
So they test the heroin, and of course, it tests positive. And so I take the $85,000 and put it in a shopping bag.
Right.
Go downstairs, go over to the restaurant, and we leave the restaurant, but I'm carrying the bag.
Right.
And they're walking with me, and there's surveillance videos and tapes of me carrying the bag and then handing the bag to them and them walking away. When they walked away with that $85,000, I was in.
Right.
Oh yeah.
You were done.
I was their golden goose in Philadelphia.
Yep.
Here, there was no reason for them to check on me.
Yeah.
I was their man in Philly.
Right. The vouch was made. The deal is
yeah.
done. You're in.
I think
So
it's
now they started pushing heroin on me.
I think it's important that you walked away from the kilo deal. You set a precedence
Oh
of
yeah,
control.
no, I says, there's no way.
But I mean, it would have looked fishy.
Oh, if
you
I
know,
says,
just-
"Oh yeah, I'll take a kilo."
he's a cop. You know what
Well,
I
that
mean?
was the
Like,
hook.
definitely
They
something's
wanted
wrong.
you to bite
You
it.
know,
They would
in
just
so
rob
many
you.
words in my slang, you know, I says, "Bafa," you know, I'm not going to do anything with you. I don't know who you
Right.
are, because Afado Gato was getting really nasty with me. And that's when Alberto Ficalora, you know, stepped in because he wanted the deal to go.
Yeah.
And that's how it started. And they would come down from New York with a kilo of heroin and always fronted to me. I never had to have money. I always, they would front me a kilo, and I would say, "Okay, I'll have the money in a few weeks for you."
But the stressor, you know, I think people need to understand it's just not an easy deal, right? What's going on in Frank's brain at that time is, if I go for the kilo, they might rob me, right? They're trying to test you.
Oh, yeah.
It's all a test, right? At this point in the game, in the beginning, your wheels are spinning back in the front and the sides, different parts of your brain, and you're trying to figure out, are these guys testing me? Are they setting me up to rip me? Did they doubt me? Did they think I'm a rat? Like, you know,
But
so it's
once they fronted me the heroin
you're in.
from the first deal, I knew I was in.
Right.
And then when they came down with a kilo of heroin and they fronted it to me, and there were a number of, but in the meantime, I had a life with Alberto Ficalora. I would go and have lunch at his pizza shop, and we would get all the intelligence information that we could. And every day I would get something like, they made a big seizure in Rochester, New York. The guy had a tile company in Rochester,
right.
and they were bringing in the heroin in the pallets in the tile,
Right.
and the heroin was secreted in the pallets. Well, DEA seized it. And so when I saw Alberto and Paolo, they said, "That was our shipment." They said, but the guy that they were wanted was a guy by the name of Ragusa. But he says, always keep in mind, he says, if things get hot, go to the Dominican Republic. He says, because we control the Dominican Republic. We own it.
Right.
He says, we do all our money laundering down there, or a lot of our money laundering down there, you know, in the casinos.
Okay.
So they said, that's where Ragusa went. So this was intelligence information.
Which you would have never gleaned.
Yeah, the Caesar did what you call like tickle the wire, right?
Oh,
Cause
yeah.
them to start to talk about it and give up more information.
Oh, yeah. You know, every day they knew I had an import-export company in Philadelphia. And I says, you know, we could use my import-export company. I got I got it in Germany, in Frankfurt, Germany. We could bring the heroin from Sicily to Italy, no problem. And then over the border in Germany. And how they would do it is they'd put it in a German car that broke down in Italy,
Right.
and they tow it across the border, and the heroin would be in it. So the Sicilian says, "Oh, I want to see your company, see what it's like." So now we have to call the German police and say, "Hey, we got this deal with the Sicilians. I need my company, Prima Import Export, Trevose, Pennsylvania, my subsidiary in Frankfurt." They said, the BKA were very professional, the German police.
Right.
They said, "Okay, we'll set it up." So now I fly over to Frankfurt with the Sicilian. We land at the airport, and this big burly German comes up to me. I never met him in my life. "Oh, Frank, so good to see you." And I introduce him to Giovanni Laporta. We go out to a car, and it's a big Mercedes. He says, "See what Frank got me?" We drive to Frankfurt,
Right.
and we pull up to this company, Prima Import Export,
Oh, man.
over the door.
They had it all put together for you, huh?
Yeah. I go in, and there's this 22-year-old blonde sitting behind the desk. "Oh, Mr. Frank, so good to see you. I made the cookies you like." And she hands me cookies. I've
Right.
never met her in my life.
And you don't even know what kind of cookies you like.
I didn't even know what I liked.
Did you eat them?
So we go into the office.
Did you eat the cookies?
Yeah,
Were they good?
they were good.
All right.
And so the office, of course, has sound and video.
Right.
And we talk about how we're going to do it, okay? How we're going to get the heroin over into Germany, and everything goes well. So we go back to the United States. Now it comes time to go back to do the deal, and we're going to meet in Italy.
Okay.
So I fly to Rome, and
Are you taking Giovanni with you again?
no, at that time they're supposed to meet me there.
Okay.
I'm taking my bodyguard,
Okay.
Bill Keene, who was my bodyguard, at DEA.
Undercover bodyguard. Yep.
Yeah,
So they broke off and they were going to meet you in Rome.
they were going to meet me in Rome. So a day passes and they don't show up. And so they said, I call them. I says, "Where are you? Come back, come back. We can't do anything. It's too hot over there. Come back." So I come back, and they come down to Philadelphia, and they said, "We had to kill a judge, and it's too hot in Sicily
They
for
killed
us to
a
do
they
anything."
killed a judge in
and they were
Sicily?
talking about Judge Chinizzi, who they
Oh, really?
Okay.
who they murdered.
Yeah.
And they said that we can't move anything. We never went back to Europe to do the deal because they were bringing it in pallets, and they were bringing it in Alitalia. In those days, you didn't have to accompany your baggage. You could fly, you could send unaccompanied baggage to the United States. So Frank Pagano was up in Milan as an employee of Alitalia. He would put a suitcase on an Alitalia flight going from Milan, Italy to JFK. They had a baggage handler at Alitalia at JFK. He knew what bag to look for.
Right.
And when it came in unaccompanied, he'd grab it, and of course,
Yeah.
they'd get it in, and it would be like 20 kilos of heroin.
Right.
So they were doing this every few days. So the heroin was really coming. The people have to understand that the cell that I was involved in, the Laportas and Ficalora, they were bringing in $1 million a day. Think about it.
$1 million at that
$1
time.
million a day.
Right.
And it would go to an apartment house in Brooklyn.
How many here? I want to slow you down a little bit again because you got so much information. But how did you go from $85,000 of heroin to now you're flying to Italy and Rome and was there a lot of heroin deals?
Once the 85,000 went down,
Yeah.
and then when they fronted me a kilo, and I paid them for the kilo, I mean, I was the golden goose.
And they're looking,
could
they're
do no
always looking
wrong.
for arteries, right? They're looking for new avenues to bring this stuff
Oh,
in.
yeah.
So they're constantly. So once they realized that you were a legit guy and a capable
Like,
guy
they came
with the
to
means,
my company in Philadelphia.
they saw it all.
They
right?
saw it.
So
And
really,
what
they
we would do
victimized you.
Again, Mission Impossible. We would rent a truck,
Right.
and we had a metallic stickum that we put on the side of the truck that said my company, Prima Import Export, Trevose, Pennsylvania. So when they pulled into the lot, they saw my truck.
Right.
Okay. At Christmas time, we went out and bought wine. Okay, cases of wine, and we had a stamp made, imported, Prima Import Export,
Nice.
Trevose, Pennsylvania.
It's the little
And we
thing.
just stamped it on top of the case of wine. So when I gave the Sicilians the wine, I didn't say anything, figuring that when they're opening up the case of wine, they're going to see Prima Import Export, which they probably did.
Looks like you transport something other
know.
than just heroin.
So,
Yep. Brilliant work.
yeah.
Is there a time when you had your identity challenged or your legend challenged, or was there a time when you came up against somebody that questioned who you really were, like higher up in the families, whether it be Bonanno?
No, nobody
Bruno's.
ever questioned.
Nobody ever questioned, just because of the flow of money.
Sicilians were sold that I was a made guy. It's funny. We used to hang out at an after-hours place in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Now, you had the Bruno family there. You had Nicky Scarfo, and you had the Sicilians. Well, of course, I would go in with the Sicilians. Well, the Bruno family, nobody knew me,
Right.
but they figured I was one of the Sicilians.
Right.
And so the Sicilians figured I was being nice, staying with them,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so nobody ever questioned anything.
Did you still have your cigarette racket going at the same
was
time?
wondering.
No, once we got into the heroin,
Dropped it.
it was just the heroin. One day, Alberto Ficalora says to me, "Come on downstairs. I want to show you something." We go downstairs in the pizza shop, and there's 30 kilos of cocaine on the table. And I says, "What's this?" He says, "Oh, take a few kilos." I says, "I'm not into that." He says, "We control the cocaine too." Paolo Laporta had his little 6-year-old son with him. And so I said in Italian, "I feel scumbari. I feel itchy with the little kid being
Right.
here, So he says to the little kid, he says, "Giovanni, what do you see?" And this little mafioso says, "I see nothing."
Nothing.
6-year-old, I
Trained.
see nothing.
Train for the life.
Did you introduce any other undercovers? Like, was there other undercovers or support personnel that were like going through a lot of these things with you?
Well, yeah, my bodyguard.
Okay.
And that was another thing to show you how ruthless they were. We're sitting in the car one day, and my bodyguard, who was half a nut, but he was a good agent, comes out with a Claymore mine. Now, a Claymore mine is an explosive that when it explodes, it shoots shrapnel in front of you,
Right.
So the Alberto says, "What's that?" And so the agent says, "It's a Claymore mine," and explains to him what it does. He says, "I want one." I says, "What are you going to do with one of those?" He says, "Well, a guy opened up a pizza shop. I want to make an example."
Nice.
I says, "What are you going to do with it?" He says, "At noontime, I'm gonna let it go off." I says, "You're
Oh,
going to
man,
kill
kill
all
everybody,
innocent
yeah.
people."
Right.
This is how they were.
Well, obviously you didn't sell it to him, but did he question why you didn't?
I'll tell you how Alberto Ficalora was. The cigarette machines, he would go into a place that had a cigarette machine, and he says, "Oh, I'd like you to take my cigarette machine."
Right.
And of course, the restaurant owner would say, "Well, I already have somebody." "No, you don't understand. I want you to take my machine." So the restaurant owner would say, "No, I'm not." So the next thing you knew, they were sticking chewing gum in the machine, so it was inoperable.
Right. Jamming it up.
So now he comes back a day later. He says, "I'd like you to take my cigarette machine." Well, they knew that if they didn't take the cigarette machine, it was going to be stuffed again.
Yeah.
So they would take it. If they didn't take it, one night they would steal the machine out of the guy's restaurant.
He was into everything then.
Oh,
They're moving heroin, and he's
ruthless.
worried about a cigarette machine so much he's
Yeah, but that's
packing
good
This
guns
is
money.
the way they were. They
Yeah,
had
it's
he
good
had
racket.
the pizza shop. It was a successful pizza shop.
Was it good pizza?
A very good pizza.
Yeah, but back then, and again, they used to clean the money through the pizzeria, so it's
Yeah, they
important to know.
laundered it.
You need it to show clean money.
Sure.
Yeah.
Tax,
but they had it
tax.
locked down to the point where, and correct me if I'm wrong, Frank, but even the napkins, the cups, and the boxes they used in pizzerias back then had to come through certain guys because there's that much money that's being made in these industries.
Oh,
right?
yeah. Even the cheese came from Eagle Cheese, which was Mafia controlled in New York.
Yep.
And all the other stuff. We just happened to say we had a shipment of cheese, you know. Yeah, you're right. It was controlled by the Sicilians, the Bonanno family in Brooklyn.
Yeah. So you think about it, those little rackets, they raked in cash on top of cash. Those cigarette machines, they were hundreds, if not thousands, all over different boroughs throughout New York, New Jersey, Philly.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I wanted to bring in. Like, you guys are so familiar with all this, and it's like to understand what the mafia was involved in, literally everything. Cheese, the cigarettes, the heroin, the cocaine. Like,
oh yeah, they were. As I say, he said to me, "We control the cocaine too."
Now, as the case progresses, how do you close out the pizza connection? How does that come to an end? That case
against my wishes.
Okay.
I was so into them.
Yeah.
Every day when I met them, I was finding out intelligence, who was killing who. Oh, Alberto Ficalora says to me, we're in an after hours place, and he points to two Sicilians. He says, you see those two? They show no respect. They're not men of honor.
Mm-hmm.
And it's embarrassing to us. A month later, they killed both of them.
I was going to say that.
And they were their own guys?
Their own guys.
They killed their own guys.
Oh, yeah.
And you kind of knew what they were getting at. I would assume by now you understood what they were saying.
Oh, yes.
Disrespectful.
They show no respect.
Yeah. When they get that scowling look, you know something's going to happen.
They killed the brothers a month apart from one another.
Yeah.
Okay? You saw how ruthless they were.
Right.
So now it comes time to arrest them. And I'm saying, no, please don't arrest them. Well, we're going to make this big sweep and we're going to do away with the Sicilian Mafia connection.
Oh, yeah.
The Attorney General is going to get on the air and say, we solved the heroin problem.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? I said, please don't do it.
Right.
So I says, I owe them $150,000, stiff them. I says, how am I going to stiff them? The first thing they're going to do is they're going to come after me.
Yeah.
We're men of honor, stiff them because we got them up on the wire and we'll listen to everything they're saying.
But they're risking your safety at the meantime.
You better believe it.
We've been in that position.
Yeah,
I used to hang out at a nightclub called Sinelli's in Cherry Hill. So when the Sicilians were looking for me to do me,
Right.
there would be like telephone call for Frank Pagano, because if I went to the phone, the Sicilians would be waiting for me.
Mm-hmm.
The Sicilians went to the wise guys, and they says, we have to talk to Frank Pagano. So the wise guy says, oh, I think he's going to have lunch at such and such a restaurant in Philadelphia. Sure as hell, there's a van outside the restaurant in Philadelphia waiting for me to show up. Right. So, I mean, they called every Pagano in New Jersey looking for me.
Really?
Because we would call people and say, did you get a call from somebody looking for Frank Pagano? They said, yeah, a guy with an accent was calling asking for Frank Pagano.
And where were you at this time? You were laying low?
Well, I was hiding.
Right.
You're
not with your family.
So
I was no longer in the penthouse apartment.
No, they stiffed in the $150,000.
Yeah.
So now they're looking for you.
What happened? They put a contract out on me. It comes time to arrest the Sicilians. Mm-hmm. So we want to know where they are. So I call Paolo Laporta and I says, Paolo, I'd like to take care of, what I owe you. He says to me, no, that's okay. It's already went to the collection agency. In other words, they put a contract out on me.
Yeah. It's done. There's no way to pay it back.
Forget about it.
Yeah, the only way to pay it back is with your life.
So they arrest them all. And eventually they find out, of course, I'm an undercover agent. Now, normally, you don't see them again until you go to trial, okay? Mm-hmm. But through their attorney, they said the Sicilian wanted to talk to me in jail. And they said, would you go and see him? I says, yeah, I don't have any problem with him. So what we did was we took pictures of their girlfriends, of their wives, their kids, their houses, their parents, and I had them with me. So I figured when I went to see him, if he threatened me, I'd say, look, there's 12 copies of these pictures of 12 agents. If anything happens to me, even if I get hit by a bus, they're going to come for you.
Right.
And they're going to do your family. But that never happened.
Really?
I went to see the Sicilian. We sat down. He says, Frank, I want your advice. Should we go to trial?
You're still like that with him, right?
Yeah.
You're still, yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I says, what can I say to you? I says, you can't say it's entrapment because I did 12 hand-to-hands with you.
Right.
You can't say I entrapped you. By hand-to-hand, I mean that it wasn't through an intermediary. Paolo Laporta handed the heroin to me personally, hand-to-hand.
Right.
So when I go to testify, I would say, you did 12 hand-to-hands with me, meaning that there's no ifs, ands, or buts. No intermediary delivered it somewhere. I didn't pick it up in the trunk of a car. You personally handed it to me.
Direct contact.
And that's a hand-to-hand.
Yeah, that's there's really no room for litigation in a courtroom when it's like, I put the dope in your hand and he put the money in your hand. And
Yeah. And that's why their attorney said to me, Jerry Lefcourt said to me, oh, it was a brotherly relationship. I
Right.
says, no. And so they says, well, I think we're gonna go to trial. Okay. So they go to trial. They bring down one of the biggest attorneys in New York just to cross-examine me, a guy by the name of Jerry Lefcourt. And his only job was to cross-examine me. And that's what he brings out. He says, Agent Panessa, wasn't your relationship with my clients a brotherly relationship? I says, Counselor, it was a business relationship. I bought over $1 million worth of heroin from them.
Yeah.
I says, that was more of a business relationship.
Right.
Well, of course, they were convicted and they got 15 to 20 years. But the thing that happened was, instead of making it all one big pizza connection, they broke it up because every U.S. attorney's office wanted a piece of the action.
Yes.
And that
Each
always
district.
happens. Now, by this time, Rudy Giuliani was the U.S. attorney in New York. Okay. And under him was Louis Free, who became,
FBI
director of the FBI. And he was his chief assistant U.S. attorney. So they took all the major people in Brooklyn and they gave Philadelphia, 10 people in Philadelphia. And they made it like two separate cases, but it was all one big conspiracy.
Yep.
But this is what it was. And they made the big headlines.
Well, everybody wants to, all the politicians and lawyers, they want time at the podium, right?
Yeah.
So
They wanted the Mafia. We got the Sicilian Mafia. They're all arrested. Well, this is what I did. We seized the records from Giovanni and Paolo Laporta of their dealers in Puerto Rico. Okay. So now I had the books. Now this guy got a half a kilo on such and such a day.
Right.
This guy owes $40,000. So I fly to Puerto Rico and I contact these 5 people. And I says, Giovanni and Paolo were arrested, but I took over. I want to meet you.
really,
So they show up.
Are these like Puerto Rican guys?
Yeah, Puerto Rican guys.
the
So they
suppliers.
speak English and everything? Or?
These are guys. These were the dealers for the reporters. And so I says, you owe $40,000. I says, and you a half kilo. I says, I'll tell you what, you were paying such and such amount for this. To show good faith, now that I've taken over, I'm going to give you the product for X amount of dollars. So I'll meet you next Monday and we'll do the deal.
Right.
Well, the next Monday comes, none of them show up. So months later, when they were arrested, they asked them, why didn't you show up? They said, because the real person that took over for the Laportas contacted us the day after you met
Oh,
us.
wow. And jumped the gun. Yeah.
See, that's how bad we did away with the Sicilian Mafia.
Right. Yeah.
And distributing heroin.
No, it took a
Oh,
week.
then somebody took over the next day.
Somebody
after you-
took
yeah.
over
Yeah.
the next day.
Now, what happens after that case comes down? I mean, obviously Frank Pagano's persona is you just do away with that, or you continue on in your career.
I continue on
Right.
as Frank Pagano. There were a number of cases I did. I went to Canada and met with the Catrone family. I met with the Colombians, and I had a Learjet, with 2 DEA agents as my pilots.
Right.
And so when I negotiated with the Colombian, he wanted me to fly to an island off the coast of Colombia to pick up the cocaine. And I says, no, I don't want to come down there. So I says, why don't we meet in El Salvador? Because we had things set up in El Salvador. So anyway, I meet the Colombian in Teterboro Airport
In New Jersey.
In New Jersey. I fly in my big ass Learjet, my $6 million Learjet.
Right.
The Colombian gets on the jet with me, okay, and we take off. And we're talking dope and all that. And I says, we could do the deal in El Salvador. And after we're flying around for about a half hour, I call the pilot and I said, where are we? He says, oh, we're around Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Now, the reason why I asked where we were, because we had a judge in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, that already gave me permission to wiretap these 3 cell phones.
Okay.
So I says, oh, why don't we land in Harrisburg and have lunch? So the plane lands in Harrisburg, and I say to the Colombian, these phones are clean. Pick any one you want, and you can call your people in Colombia. So I get off the plane, and he uses one of the phones.
Right.
Are these like a big bag phone or something? Like what?
The little cell phone.
What year is this?
This is 1990.
Okay, so you got like the flip phones in. So
Yeah,
a wiretaps where they can actually listen to
Yeah.
every phone conversation that's made.
Yeah.
So you've got them set up with 3 phones in the plane.
In the plane.
And you got
Pick
off.
any one you want.
Okay.
But that
And
just
I get
shows
off.
your skill set, that you have enough thought to know to have the Harrisburg it was, Pennsylvania?
Yeah, Harrisburg,
Judge. The
The
Pennsylvania.
judge in that district sign
yeah.
off on these, so when you land in that area, I mean,
Yeah.
the timing is
So
perfect.
he can make a phone call and you're allowed
Yeah,
to
we-
collect
we
that.
could wire it,
Right.
you know.
And he uses the phones and he starts making his calls?
And so he used one of the phones and called his people.
Right.
And so we we negotiated that I would go to El Salvador, and meet with him. And another thing I did was back in 1990, they sent me to Italy to work with Judge Giovanni Falcone. And he was the Mafia judge. And he tried 300 mafioso at one time. And the informant that they used was Tommaso Buscetta,
Okay.
who was a made Bonanno guy. But the Mafia changed by that time. They never killed your family. Well, they killed his brother. They killed his son.
Yeah.
They killed everybody in his family. So he said, hey, this is no longer the Mafia that I know. I'm gonna cooperate. So he became an informant of ours in the witness protection program. And so I was over in Italy, and I was the go-between between the Italians and the agent that controlled Tommaso Buscetta, where we had him hidden in the United States.
Right.
So whenever any meats had to be made, the Italians would come to me. Like at one time they said, we want to give him $100,000. So what I did was, it was in lira, so I had to take the lira and got $100,000 cash. And I flew to the United States, and we made arrangements for the Italian police to meet with Tommaso so we could give him the $100,000.
Right.
So we met in a hotel, and we had dinner and all that. So I give him the $100,000. So you think he would pay for the meal.
Right.
The bill comes, and he's looking like he doesn't have a penny on him.
Right, right.
I had
He's
just
got
given him $100,000.
alligator arms. Yeah, yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And so they this is what we would do. There were a few times where magistrates wanted to talk to Tommaso, and I would make arrangements. I would fly from Italy with the magistrates. And I remember one time we met at the Newark DEA office, okay? And the magistrates started talking to them. And he was a stone killer. He killed many people, Tommaso Buscetta.
Right.
And one of them said something to him, and he said in Italian, "Io sono Tommaso Buscetta," meaning that I'm Tommaso Buscetta, and what you said insulted me.
Offensive. Mm-hmm.
And the guy just shivered, because you saw his eyes glazed over. I mean, he was a stone killer.
And they committed to a life, right? They took the omerta, the oath of omerta back then. It meant something to those guys.
By that time, he still hadn't told us who in the Italian government was on their payroll.
Right.
Okay. And so he always used to say that he called me Zio Ciccio, Uncle Frank.
Uncle Frankie.
And he'd always say, "Be careful."
Yeah.
And so I'd say, "Where? Of the Sicilians?" And he'd say, "Frank, just be careful."
Right.
What it was warning me is that the people that I was dealing with, our equivalent of the Italian Attorney General, was on the Mafia's payroll, and so was the president of Italy.
Right. Careful.
And this is what he was telling me, but eventually he came out and named them.
I find it amazing that you were able to do all those things, Frank. Fly into the country, fly out of the country with all the corruption you just said right there. With all the corruption that was going on at that time, they were killing the judges on both sides, right? The American mob, the Sicilian mob, they were the most violent. Here you are, you went right into the cartels. I mean, the cartels were open communication with Cosa Nostra back then.
Yes, very much so. They had the World Cup in Italy in 1990, and we had information that the Cali cartel, the Rodriguez brothers, were coming over with their family because they had soccer teams in Colombia, and two of their players were playing on the national Colombian team. And so I went to DEA headquarters, and they said, "We want to send this captain, this Colombian captain, over there so he can point them out." I says, "We don't need anybody from Colombia."
Right.
I says, "We know what they look like, So the powers to be, no, this guy can be trusted and all that. So they send him over. Of course, he tells his general, who is bought by the Rodriguez brothers, everything is going fine. His family comes over. We put them in the hotel. We had the phone wired in the hotel.
Right.
We find out where they sent $30,000 over to a bank for spending money. Everything's going perfect. The son gets on the phone with one of the Rodriguez brothers and says, "Daddy, when are you coming over?" And he says, "Oh, I'll be over in a day or two." So everything's beautiful. We have everything set up. We, with the Italian police, were able to look at wherever the Colombian team was playing, we're able to look at every seat in the stadium. They had cameras set up where we could point out if we saw the Rodriguez brothers.
Right.
Okay. Well, as you say, there was so much corruption. Not only did this captain tell his boss, the general, who told the Rodriguez brothers, but of course somebody in the Italian police, says, "Oh, DEA has a setup at the stadium, looking for the Cali cartel."
And that's the problem with doing international cases. You have so many different governments.
We saw the family go to the matches and all that.
Wow.
But we did get their money launderers because they were there.
Okay.
And we did arrest their money launderers, and we seized $3 million.
That's fruitful.
So it was well worth it.
Wow.
And that's such is life.
Such is life.
Such is your life.
I'll tell you another. I'll tell you another quick story. 1975, they send me to become a sniper. So the Marines trained me as a sniper.
The DEA sent you to become a sniper?
Yes, a sniper.
Okay.
And I was able to hit a bullseye at 1,000 yards with open sights.
Why did they want you to be a
yards
sniper?
with open sight?
Yeah.
Little did I know I was being trained to assassinate President Torrijos of Panama.
Really?
Yeah.
Whoa.
Huh.
So
That should have been a precursor.
they give me my jacket. They give me a specially built M14, special ammunition. And I was an animal because they were training me in July, hot as hell, and I would only be able to put one round in at a time, and they would critique each round that I fired, and all day.
Right.
So a few years later, Jack Anderson's column says, in 1975, agents of the DEA were trained to assassinate President Torrijos.
Really? It leaked out.
And so they said it was the mastermind was Colonel Lucian Canine from the CIA, who is now an employee of DEA. So I look at the roster of DEA, I'm fine. Sure as hell, there's Lucian Canine like in the library or something like that,
Yeah.
And I was actually trained to do that, but they ended up blowing them up on a plane. It was easier for them to kill Torrijos that way.
But their intentions would have put you as close as you could be to snipe him and kill him.
Yeah.
Wow. Unbelievable.
Weird.
I didn't even know the DEA killed people.
It was a weird run. That's why they call me the Chameleon,
Right.
because I put on many different colors,
I could see that.
Yeah. And I was lucky.
Yeah. Well, it was luck, and it was your skill set too, Frank.
Well, I had that. I never went into a situation where I felt that I might be compromised.
Yeah.
Like they would say to me, well, what kind of gun are you carrying? I'm saying I'm carrying a 25 caliber Beretta. Well, that's not authorized. I said, well, I'm not authorized to do undercover work.
That's
then.
right.
So I carried a 25 Beretta.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they would say to me, we want to put a wire on you, meaning a device that they could listen to what I was saying. I said, no, I'm not wearing one. Well, why aren't you wearing one? Because I know when I go into that bar, they're going to have women there, and they're going to come up to me and grab me to see if I'm wearing a device. Matter of fact, I was buying off a Sicilian, and his attorney was the famous William Kunstler.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
John Gotti's.
And so
right.
It was the first female black judge, federal judge, Constance Baker Motley. And so when they were picking the jury, he's picking all black people to be on the jury. And I'm saying, this is the Sicilian mafioso, And we couldn't figure out why. But see, Kunstler doesn't prepare his questions, He has underlings to prepare the questions. So apparently they got a wiretap. They got conversations of me talking to the Sicilian about deals and all that. And on it, somebody on the tape, Kunstler says to me on the stand, Agent Panessa, isn't it true that you were talking to my client and you said nasty things about black Americans? I says, no, sir, I don't recall. Now I see why they have the black jurors and the black female judge. And so they said, isn't it true the government doesn't want to play that tape? I says, no, I don't recall saying anything like that. So anyway, they play the tape and you hear, hey, how you doing? Yeah, good. Those SOB so-and-sos, you can't trust them. They're lazy SOBs and all that. They stiffed me out of this. And so Kunstler says, see, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you see what he's calling black Americans? The judge says to him, Counselor, that's your client saying that.
Oh, really?
And I could see the jurors going,
boy, right.
Can't wait to convict this guy. So these are stories,
Right.
million stories.
Yep. And that's a hard thing to walk away from a little bit too, right? When and especially culturally having understanding and a background of that, being of Italian descent.
Yeah.
It's hard to walk away from that when you have that much status and stature.
When they saw that, they thought I was a made guy, the respect that I would get.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it was out of fear or what, but they always showed me respect when they thought I was a made guy.
Right.
I would walk away. I'd go to lunch and we'd spend $2,000 in lunch. And then I'd have an opportunity to go home and I'd have hot dogs with my kids and my wife.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
Of course you didn't want to leave. You're flying around in private jets, spending $2,000 on lunch. I'm like, I'm staying here forever.
Yeah. My Uncle Sam was a rich man. He took care of me, but
I was spending $25,000 a week as a mafioso.
but
just
people,
to
you know,
cloak myself.
but again, we weren't really spending that much money. We were using the government's money, but we were also making money. A lot of people don't understand that too. You know,
Yeah, a lot of people don't understand when we arrested these people, we seized over $3 million.
so with the return
You know,
on
so
the
we're
investment,
ahead of the game.
right? We were always ahead. All of our cases,
always.
we spent a lot of money on some cases, right? But those cases, the return on investment was tremendous.
Oh, yeah,
So we always
definitely.
came out ahead. And you also had a career in film as well, right, Frank?
Godfather III was filmed in Italy. So they came to the American embassy looking for American-looking people because the extras they had in Italy were, 5'2". So you needed American-looking people. So they hired a lot of Americans. So my wife said to me, "Why don't we become extras?" So we became extras. But then when they found out who I was, I remember George Hamilton coming up to me and saying, "Frank, you must have had the most interesting life I could think of." I says, "George, give me your looks for one night and you can have my badge." Because Harry had this beautiful glow.
Right.
So anyway, I was invited to a New Year's Eve party and Coppola was there and his sister Thalia Shire and his parents. So the casting director comes up to me and she says, "I hear that in real life, you were an undercover agent into the Mafia. How would you like to play a Mafia Don in Godfather III? I says, "Well, I was already an extra in a lot of the scenes." I says, "I was in the stockholders meeting. I was in a scene with Al Pacino and George Hamilton." So she said, "Are you willing to shave off your mustache and not wear glasses?" And I said, "Sure." So I became a Mafia Don and I get killed in the Atlantic City scene.
Oh, do you?
But it was funny. The actors took me under their wing, because I was an extra.
Yeah.
But now I'm somebody.
Yeah.
And I'm on the set with them all the time. And they said, we're going to tell you where you can get a better contract. And the two actors were Al Ruscio and Carmine Caridi. And they said, "We're going to go and get you a better contract." So they got me a contract where I would get paid every week until the scene was completed.
Right.
Well, they knew that Francis Ford Coppola would change his mind. So halfway through doing the Atlantic City scene, he says, "No, we'll come back to this." So now I'm getting paid every week
Nice.
until the scene is done. Then they said, "Well, we see you on camera all the time. We want you to get killed on camera." And so they said to me, "Well, we're going to go to the stunt director and get you a special contract because you get paid for every fall you take."
Yeah.
So they put the squiggies on my back.
Right.
The squiggies are
The little blood shatters.
the blood sacs that explode. And so there I run to the door in this Atlantic City scene and you see me take 3 bullets in the back, and I fall and I get paid extra for that.
Yeah. It's nice. It's good to have a contract for you in your benefit than on you, I would
know.
assume, right? Because you
But
came
I'll
from
tell
both
you,
worlds.
When I went like that, what had happened was one of the pads slipped.
Yeah.
And when they shot it, that the shell burnt me.
Yeah.
And I went,
Oh, you got,
It
got a
was
real
for real.
reaction out of it. Yeah.
And that's the scene where you see Andy Garcia running across with Al Pacino and the bullets are following them and they go out the door.
Yeah.
It was a wild time. They were there for 6 months. They came to my house. They ate at my house. Al Martino, the singer who played Johnny Fontaine,
Yeah.
he loved to cook. So we got pictures and videos of him cooking at my house.
Yeah. That's awesome.
It was a great time.
That's a coup de grace. Oh, I'm glad you got whacked out on a movie set and not real
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
I'm glad you're here sitting with us, telling us the story. And it worked out well. So,
Yeah.
well, we appreciate you sharing them with us, Frank, and we appreciate you being here and taking the time to just give us a look inside of your life and what it was as a covert operative and as a DEA agent for all these years.
Yeah.
You truly have sacrificed. You literally worked all over the globe. put yourself in harm's way several times, and you know it's for the good of us and the country. Really, you're a true patriot. So
Well, thank you.
Appreciate it.
For behind-the-scenes photos, merchandise, and exclusive content, visit InsideTheLife.org. Rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get podcasts.